So here we are. You're getting into the collaborative writing, and I haven't looked or counted what's happening in the groups. I've seen a few posts. Let me just have a quick look see here. Okay, a little bit slower, possibly than I would like to see. I have a to-do date on this of the 14th, and that does give you a few days' time. But what people should be doing is doing their introduction, starting their first few 500-word pieces. So check in and remind your group members what your interest in the topic is. Work out group meeting times. Write your first 500-word pieces, probably in Google Docs, and share a link to it here. And there you go. That's a little bit longer than it needs to be. You've got a lot of, and there's the Formula One one, which is good. I was expecting that to come. And there's points in there, which is great. Is that, yeah, actually that could be 500 words. That's fine. There's enough words there for people to. So that group, sports group, people are winning in pole position right at the moment in terms of writing the first 500 words. And having it all in there means that everybody can see it and everybody can read it, and that's fantastic. So where do we go from here? In the words of the famous song from the musical episode of Buffy, which you should all watch. So that's where we are. What I want to do is drag this down here. Essentially, I have two more topics to do. One is surveys and interviews, it's down the road, but I want to look at transmedia and collaborative writing and transmedia storytelling. So I have three readings here on which there is no particular set discussion topic. There is a possibility that you may do a storyboard of your collaborative writing using a mind map. I'll explain that in the end. There's some links about transmedia storytelling. There's an article which I think probably you'll find quite useful. Google Docs in an out-of-class collaborative writing activity. It describes a class doing an exercise very similar to what you're doing. So I think you should all make an effort to have a read of that one. All right, that's important. These are in order of importance. Understanding nomadic collaborative learning groups, digital nomads, people who toss their laptop in their rucksack and take off and work from the beach in Bali. And we all envy them, except now, of course, we're all digital nomads in a way, trying to find some corner where we can work effectively, wherever we can find a place to park our laptop and decent broadband. So perhaps being a digital nomad is less exciting and much less exotic than it was 12 months ago. But it's interesting because it also talks about collaboration amongst distributed groups of people. So that makes it interesting and worth having a read of. And I think it's increasingly part of the future in terms of the ways people will work. Network scholars in a networked organization, again, is about knowledge work, distributed knowledge work. It's also interesting, but it's probably the least of the three. Get to it if you can, but read these lightly. Take them easily in your stride, and don't get too hugely hung up about the detail of them, because there is no set. You're working on the collaborative writing, so this is reading to fill in the background and to equip you to do it better, to think about ways of doing it. But apart from that, you can probably, as I say, read them briskly and lightly. But there will be a PowerPoint going in here to talk a little bit about transmedia and collaborative and transmedia storytelling. So we are changing. The ways and the spaces in which we write are changing. It used to be the case that we wrote linear text, great chunks of heavy, dense linear text in academic journal articles, and it was very formal and very technical and very complicated. Now we have a spectrum. We have our own personal notes, which are private, which are rough, stream of consciousness, unpolished notes. We have, contributions to discussion forums, which are closed to members. So you can control who and what you say, and you can expect not to be quoted outside the group. So you have a certain degree of freedom of expression, and they're not necessarily that formal. We are using Google Docs for collaborative writing, shared negotiated piece of writing, which The expectation is that at the end this will be a finished piece of writing which is worthy of showing to the world, and many of them are. There are things like wikis where anybody can edit, which is entirely a crowdsourced and collaborative platform for creating knowledge. There are things like your blogs, which public. It's a form of writing in public, but it is personal and you have control over what you put there. So this is a whole spectrum, and there's other things as well in terms of different types of media. So even in linear text, there's tweets. There's a form called a twessay, which is essentially a series of linked tweets, an essay written in a series of tweets, which is the same thing as a Twitter thread. Blogs, formal essays. Presentations are a form of linear media, in that they start at the beginning, they go through the slides in order, which is something that I sometimes don't do. Podcast, either audio or video. These days it's almost hard to tell the difference between a presentation and a video podcast. It used to be the case that you did a presentation in class with your PowerPoint standing in front of the room. This year, of course, you're going to have to be recording it and delivering it on video. So what you're effectively going to be delivering in the other core course this semester is essentially a video podcast. And it's very easy to do that. There are also non-linear forms of writing. The web obviously is a non-linear form of writing. Hypertext is a non-linear form of writing. Some games, there's the classic choose your own adventure book, but almost all games are a form of narrative. They tell a story, but it doesn't go in a straight line. Now, the idea that a story is a narrative, or that a game is a narrative, you might say some games are not a narrative, but a replay of Monopoly is a story, albeit a very simple one, and after the first 20 minutes, quite a boring one very often. But there is a story there, and it unfolds, but it certainly doesn't unfold in a predictable way because the reader, the player, has agency. You can do things to change the direction of the story. And this is an important difference in all sorts of storytelling now. The big transition was that, it used to be the case that the writer told the story. The director made the movie. The director was the auteur, to use the fancy French word. It was the director's vision that created the movie, and this was what you sat down and watched it. And you might discuss it, but it was there. Now, increasingly, there is what Henry Jenkins called convergence culture, where all the different media forms are coming together, and it is increasingly the two keywords that Henry is famous for. Three. One is transmedia. The other is convergence culture. It's a big term that all the different media are coming together. And the other is participatory culture. That the division between creators and audience is eroded. So increasingly now you have things like fan fiction, if anybody's familiar with that. But also increasingly the audience has a voice and can be deeply critical or supportive of the nature of what they're seeing on television. We saw it this week, in fact, in the trailers for Wild Irish Thyme, where the whole country went completely over the top. It remains to be seen what the movie is like, but certainly people have opinions and are voicing them, and the movie, when it eventually streams, will be an event, because people will sit around and watch it and shout at the screens, whatever screens they're watching at it. So culture has become participatory. We now participate in the creation of cultural artifacts and in the discussions and negotiations about what we like. It's no longer a case the big cinemas or the big game companies can just produce product and put it out there and say, take it or leave it. It's now, well, no, actually. And something like Minecraft, for example, allows for the enormous amount of creation of user-created content, as well as modding games. So media has become participatory. The different forms of media have converged. Stories are told across different media. So now if you're producing a movie, there will be a novelization, there will be a graphic novel, there will be merchandise, and very often there will also be a game or several games to go with the property, right? And this has now become the way we do it. So that imposes fresh problems with writing, or challenges or opportunities. And there are several different definitions. There's two major ways of saying what is transmedia. One is that the story is split across several media, and each one may stand on its own, but you only see part of the story. So the story might be complete, the graphic novel version, the movie version, each of these might be complete, or it might be that they only make sense if you link them in together. And that's a choice for the people who are creating it. How do you make that work? It's very different to sitting down and writing a straightforward, write your own novel. Nowadays, the creative landscape is much more flexible. It also means, of course, that to tell a story, to do an advertising campaign, which reaches across the different media, television, radio, social media, maybe interactive games, whatever, requires a range of different talents and skills. It's very rare that you get one creative person who can do the whole lot, although there are people out there who can do it. So that's the challenge. The other thing is, of course, that in order to do this, in order to write effectively across media, you need to be clear about what the elements of your story are. And that's where storyboarding comes in. Storyboarding is a long-standing practice in writing novels, planning for novels and fiction. It's a long-standing practice in script writing, that you lay out the story. It is coming to academic work recently. So there's very little in the way of good descriptions and good sources. The London School of Economics had a blog in 2017 where they discussed storyboarding research and how you might use the storyboarding technique, writing out the bits of your story on cards and laying them out to see how your research worked out. Now, this picture, which is from that blog, is of course not a picture of a researcher. It's actually a picture of a script writer, because a piece of research or a piece of academic writing, even the collaborative writing that you're going to be doing at the moment, never turns out as neatly as this, with all those things in neat rows and columns. There are gaps, and in fact, this is one of the few examples I was able to find, which is a chemistry article, so there's not much point assigning it as a reading because it's all about biodiesel synthesis and you wouldn't understand most of it. But this is an example of the storyboard for that process in different stages and the different types of things that happen. Planning, equipment, experiment, information about the chemical reaction, emergency preparedness. And it is a story in that it has a start and it has an end. And it moves through, but not every through line of the story. They do not all. There are some places where there are gaps. So in some sections of the story, every element is represented. In others, not everything. Obviously, as you get along towards the later stages, there isn't equipment set up because it's done. It's fair enough. And this is a slightly more detailed image of some of the elements of part of the top line of this, where there's more detail. So you have a very high level map and then you zoom into some more detail. And there's a lot of processes. One thing that there is there's the process in writing of outlining, which is quite common in writing, and many of you probably do it. And this is a writing tool called Scrivener, which is beloved of many serious writers, mainly because it's only available on the Mac. It's quite expensive, so I wouldn't recommend it. It's a very specialized tool. But it has a built-in corkboard for laying out the elements of your story. And that maps to the outline. The two interact dynamically and refresh one another. So you can take the bits of your story and juggle it around and move it about and add bits and add pieces of text, just as you would do with, if we were doing this physically, a pile of post-it notes with ideas written on them stuck on the wall, right? Or a whiteboard. But some writers absolutely love this because this whole corkboard postcard motif is something it creates an atmosphere where they're comfortable writing. And it's a form of storyboard. Here's a couple of others. There's a visual storyboard for a viral video. 8 shots, little sketch of what the shot's going to look like in the main, bit of text underneath saying what's happening. This is a storyboard example from Studio Ghibli. Many of you may be familiar with their products. So there's a space to draw, sketch the image that you're going to see, and then there's columns for the action to describe what happens in the shot, and for the dialogue and other notes. And that's genuinely what they do to plot out all those beautiful and wonderful Studio Ghibli movies. This is a set of visual storyboard elements from actually Game of Thrones. You may recognize the episode. Um, there's no text with this, it's just the visual sketches for what the action is supposed to look like. This is interesting. I like this one. This is a murder board discussion from Castle. It's actually, and this is an example of Transmedia, right? Castle's television series, Nathan Fillion, um, writer who tags along with a New York cop. And of course, like every other police procedural, they have the murder board, where all the evidence is tacked up on the wall. And you try to make linkages between it, and there's different types of evidence. And this is where storyboarding is useful for mixed methods research, where all the research isn't easily analyzable in one way, and where you're trying to make connections between different types of data, connect apples and oranges, collect people and places and times. So for anyone who watches cop shows, this will immediately ring a bell. This is how people try to explain what is the story. And of course, again, Castle is a television series, but they also made a board game out of it. It's actually a card and board game, which is now out of print. And I found this image on the web, but I cannot find a copy of the game anywhere, which is a pity because I'd like to see how they manage that whole multimedia, transmedia thing from the television series to the card driven board game. So, another possibility, of course, in terms of storyboarding, mapping your stuff out, it's very much like a game, particularly those choose your own adventure books, if anybody remembers them, or fighting fantasy, which is now being converted to digital forms. So, this is a map of an old fighting fantasy style game book showing the connections between the different nodes and the types of nodes and where they lead to. This is actually, well, it's not the same thing, it's the same idea. This is a branching narrative written using a tool called Twine, which is designed originally for building choose your own adventure style games. So it starts at the beginning, and from every node there are several possible ways you can go, and you can traverse the map. So it's a hypertext. There's no one way to go through it. Obviously, there's a best way to get to the end and to win the game. But designing this, allows you to think about alternative pathways and to create something where the reader doesn't necessarily have to go through all the nodes to get to the end of the story. Maybe they want to go through all the detailed bits and the descriptions because they like it. Maybe they're not interested in description and they just want to get the action points and they're in a hurry to get to the end of the story. Either way, it's like side quests in a game. Do you want to go on all the side quests? Do you want to go down all of these pathways? Or do you just want to get through to the end? So there is, this parallel between transmedia, participatory convergence, culture, and gaming. They come together, actually, in this point. And so the last thing there is a reference to actually one of the original pieces of collaborative writing that we did in the first year of the MA, which is where all this collaborative writing trouble comes from, which was 4 or 5 students in the first year of the master's program, and an article that we wrote together. I'm not sure if the Journal of Digital Humanity is still there, but the blog post is certainly there if you want to have a look at it. So that's a tour through what do we mean by transmedia authoring, by writing for different platforms. You write in different ways. You may present the same narrative, but obviously text, graphic novel, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, there are different ways in which to tell the same story in those different media. And the ability to sit down and think, how will I tell this story, particularly for stuff like advertising campaigns, which use visual, which use radio, which also use hashtags to get involvement going. This is the way. So writing is no longer a question of writing chunks of text. It's a question of designing and preparing transmedia experiences. All right? So this is, you will not in the future, you may be writers, but if you're going to be a writer, you'll almost certainly have to be a transmedia creator. So you need to get your head around that and get away from the great scads of text. So the only thing really I want you to do, apart from reading the articles and thinking about this, and we'll discuss this Monday evening when we come together, as many of us as can make it. We'll discuss a number of things. One is we'll discuss problems, if you have them, with the collaborative writing and how that's going, and we'll also, toss around this concept of transmedia and what it means and how it might apply. It is possible, because of the circumstances of the year this year, we're just doing the collaborative writing as a piece of writing, but it is possible. And last year, because we were all in the room, each group produced a piece of writing, a presentation, which required visual, obviously, and a podcast, and a concept for a game. The concept for the game was the hardest. Now, I'm open if groups decide that they want to do essentially, some kind of podcast, turn their piece of writing into a visual presentation podcast type thing. But I'm not making that a requirement this year because it would impose an extra workload in terms of time and space and effort, which under the circumstances would be interesting, but might be just too much work to try and negotiate collaboration on this year of all years. But hey, next year you'll be in second year and we'll find a way to make you do these fun and interesting things, assuming we're all vaccinated and back in the room. Okay, so it will happen. But what I do want you to do, consider perhaps you're going to have the initial 500 word pieces for your collaborative writing written. So what you could do is use something like a mind map, which you're familiar with, to sketch out a storyboard of your pieces as a mind map, which you can then manipulate and pull together and edit into an outline for your final text as a possibility. Give it a go, see how it works. There are, of course, other ways that you can do storyboarding of towards your final piece of work, but not so easy to do collaboratively. So we'll see how people are getting on. I can throw out some ideas if people are up for it and want to give it a go. We'll discuss it Monday in class. But that's basically what I wanted to show you and what I wanted to put in front of you as possibilities for your future as digitally nomadic transmedia creators. There you are. If anybody asks you what your career ambition is, that's what your career ambition can be.